Friends, thank you for being here today. If you have been watching the news cycle out of Washington over the past several months, you might be forgiven for thinking that the established geopolitical order of the North American continent has been permanently fractured. You might look at the headlines, the late-night social media posts from the Oval Office, and the unprecedented economic threats leveled against the United States' closest ally, and feel a sense of profound anxiety. But today, we're going to look past the noise. We are going to look past the sensationalist headlines and the aggressive rhetoric that so often dominates the modern political arena. Because beneath the surface of this manufactured crisis, a masterclass in international diplomacy is unfolding. What we are witnessing is not the story of a superpower crushing a smaller neighbor. It is the story of how a profound miscalculation by the United States administration has triggered a historic, calculated, and devastatingly effective reassertion of Canadian sovereignty. We are here to dissect the anatomy of a backfire. We are going to examine precisely how the 35% tariff ultimatum, a blunt instrument of economic coercion, did not result in Canadian submission, but instead catalyzed a strategic awakening that has fundamentally restructured the geopolitical board. Canada has not simply weathered the storm, it has quietly, methodically, and legally turned the storm back upon its origin. Before we dive into the details, I have a question for you. For those of you who have watched this bilateral relationship evolve over the past few decades, have you ever seen tensions this high? Let me know in the comments below, because your historical perspective is vital to this conversation. To truly understand the magnitude of this geopolitical shift, we have to look at what happens when raw aggression meets calculated restraint. For over a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been the gold standard of international cooperation. It is a relationship built on the longest undefended border in the world, a deeply integrated economic architecture, and a shared history of shedding blood together on the battlefields of Europe, Korea, and Afghanistan. Yet, the current administration in Washington chose to view this foundational alliance not as an asset, but as an exploitable vulnerability. The paradigm shifted with a staggering, almost incomprehensible escalation. The White House, operating under the assumption that Canada's historic economic reliance on the American market would guarantee immediate capitulation, unleashed an economic shock and awe campaign. It began with the sudden imposition of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. When Ottawa did not immediately fold, the administration doubled down, raising the tariffs to an agonizing 35%, and ultimately threatening to push them to 45%. But the economic warfare was only half of the equation. It was accompanied by a rhetorical assault that struck at the very heart of Canadian national identity. Washington dismissed Canada as the 51st state, a patronizing and deeply inflammatory insult designed to humiliate Ottawa on the global stage. Maps were circulated, rhetoric was amplified, and the traditional respect afforded to a sovereign, democratic ally was discarded in favor of aggressive, reality television-style grandstanding. This was the ultimatum. The calculus in Washington was simple, albeit dangerously flawed. Hit them hard, hit them fast, insult their leadership, and wait for the surrender. They expected emotional, reactive panic. They expected Canadian diplomats to rush to Washington, hat in hand, begging for a reprieve. Instead, they encountered a wall of cold, institutional logic. The United States administration fundamentally miscalculated the character of the nation north of the 49th parallel. They mistook Canadian politeness for weakness. They mistook a preference for consensus for a lack of resolve. What Washington failed to realize was that by attacking the very sovereignty of Canada, they united a fiercely proud nation. Canada didn't just resist the ultimatum. Ottawa recognized the vulnerability in the aggressor's strategy and initiated a geopolitical pivot that has left the White House utterly flat-footed. But how exactly did Ottawa pull this off? It required the strategy of a master chess player, someone who knows exactly how to use a much larger opponent's momentum against them. At the center of this pivot is Prime Minister Carney. To understand why the American strategy failed so spectacularly, one must understand the man who met it. Washington is currently defined by populist outbursts, emotional decision-making, and a transactional view of global affairs. Carney represents the exact antithesis. As a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, he is a man accustomed to navigating global crises, stabilizing markets with a carefully chosen word, and staring down the most powerful financial forces on the planet without blinking. Carney's strategic approach to the Washington crisis can be likened to the martial art of judo. Rather than meeting brute force with brute force, he utilized the opponent's own momentum against them. He recognized that engaging in a screaming match with the Oval Office would only feed the spectacle the U.S. administration desired. Instead, he deployed a strategy of calculated restraint, reframing the dialogue entirely. The brilliance of this approach was first put on display during his inaugural visit to the Oval Office. Sitting across from a president who views all human interaction through the lens of real estate deals and leverage, Carney delivered a masterstroke of psychological diplomacy. When pressed on the tariffs and the demands for concessions, Carney looked the president in the eye and stated, "As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale, and we're sitting in one right now. Canada is not for sale, won't be for sale ever." This was not merely a good soundbite. It was a devastatingly precise psychological maneuver. By adopting the U.S. president's own transactional lexicon, the language of real estate, ownership, and deal-making, Carney established an impenetrable boundary. He stripped the emotion from the room and replaced it with a cold, hard fact. He turned an attempt at economic bullying into a profound declaration of sovereignty. The White House had no response because one cannot argue with a statement that uses one's own core philosophy as a shield. But the true genius of Canada's response lay in its use of historical symbolism. When Washington continued its barrage of social media insults, demanding gratitude and submission, Carney did not reply with a tweet. He flew to Quebec City and stood before the historic Citadel. Context is everything. The Citadel is a star-shaped fortress built in the 19th century for one specific purpose: to defend British North America against an invasion by the United States. It is a monument of stone and iron that represents historical resilience and survival against an overwhelming southern neighbor. Standing before this imposing backdrop, Carney delivered a speech that will echo in the annals of Canadian history. "Canada does not live because of the United States," he declared, his voice measured and calm. "Canada thrives because we are Canadian. We are masters in our home. This is our own country. It's our future. The choice is up to us." The contrast could not have been starker. On one side, a chaotic administration lashing out in all caps on social media. On the other, an erudite statesman standing before a historic military fortress, appealing to law, history, and an unshakable national dignity. Washington was playing to the daily news cycle, Ottawa was speaking to history, and in doing so, Canada exposed the intellectual bankruptcy of the U.S. position to the entire world. I'm curious what you think about this tactic. Did Prime Minister Carney strike the right tone at the Citadel? Tell me in the comments if you believe this calm historical firmness is the best way to handle Washington's aggression. While this diplomatic theater captured the headlines, the real battlefield was the economy, where we are now witnessing the mathematical failure of protectionism unfold in real time. The U.S. administration's imposition of a 35% tariff was touted as a victory for America First, a mechanism to punish Canada and repatriate manufacturing. But economics is a science of consequences, not of intentions, and the mathematics of protectionism have proven to be a devastating boomerang. Let us conduct a clinical breakdown of the self-inflicted wounds currently bleeding the American domestic economy. The tariffs on Canadian goods are not paid by the Canadian government. They are taxes paid by American importers, which are immediately passed on to American consumers and businesses. The metrics of this failure are glaring. The Dow Jones Industrial Average has suffered historic slides. Gas prices across the American heartland are surging. Inflation on consumer goods, which had been slowly brought under control, has spiked again. Unemployment in the U.S. manufacturing sector is quietly, persistently rising. To understand why, one must understand the deep integration of the North American supply chain. You cannot simply build a wall across an economy that has spent a century merging into a single organism. Consider the automotive sector in Michigan and Ontario. A single car part, a bumper, a transmission component, might cross the Ambassador Bridge half a dozen times before the vehicle is completely assembled. By slapping a 35% tariff on Canadian steel, aluminum, and manufactured goods, Washington essentially levied a massive, crippling tax on its own auto industry. American factories are slowing down because they can no longer afford the Canadian raw materials required to build their products. The tariffs, designed to hurt Canada, have instead become an anvil around the neck of the American working class. But what of Canada? Did the Canadian economy collapse as Washington predicted? The answer is a resounding, historic no. Instead of capitulating, Canada accelerated an era of economic autonomy. For decades, Canadian economists have warned of the dangers of having over 70% of the nation's exports tethered to a single, occasionally volatile market. The Trump tariffs did not break the Canadian economy. They finally provided the political capital required to sever that unhealthy dependency. Ottawa initiated a rapid, aggressive, and highly successful diversification strategy. Within a staggering 6-month window, Canadian trade negotiators struck 12 new trade agreements across 4 different continents. They aggressively leveraged existing frameworks, deepening ties through the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, to open the massive markets of the Indo-Pacific, and maximizing the CETA, Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, to flood European markets with Canadian goods. The results speak for themselves. Canadian exports to the United States have dropped to pre-1980s levels. To an untrained observer, this might look like a loss. But to geopolitical strategists, it is the intentional necessary severing of a vulnerability. Canadian businesses are actively and permanently finding other customers. They are selling lumber to Japan, agricultural products to India, and advanced technology to Europe. Canada has proven that it is a global trading powerhouse in its own right. And by forcing Ottawa's hand, Washington has inadvertently engineered the economic liberation of its northern neighbor. The trade routes are being permanently redrawn, and America is being left out. The ramifications of this conflict, however, have extended far beyond North America, triggering a profound geopolitical reordering where Canada is quietly emerging as the vanguard of the world's middle powers. For the past 80 years, the free world has looked to Washington for leadership, stability, and adherence to the rule of law. But as Washington retreats into isolationist bullying and erratic protectionism, a massive global leadership vacuum has opened. Nature, in geopolitics, abhors a vacuum, and Canada, with quiet determination, has stepped into the breach. The turning point occurred at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Standing before the most powerful leaders, economists, and chief executives on the planet, Prime Minister Carney delivered a speech that fundamentally redefined Canada's role in the 21st century. He did not engage in petty name-calling. He elevated the discourse. He analyzed the state of the post-Oyo order, an order built by America, but currently being dismantled by America, and declared it to be experiencing not a transition, but a rupture. It was a clinical, devastating assessment of the chaos radiating from Washington. But Carney did not stop at diagnosis. He offered a prescription. He called on the world's middle powers, nations like Australia, Japan, South Korea, France, and Germany, to band together. He recognized that while no single nation could stand alone against the economic coercion of a rogue superpower, a united coalition of democratic, free-trading nations possessed unparalleled leverage. It was during this address that he delivered the viral doctrine that has now become the rallying cry for the international community. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu. The reaction was seismic. A standing ovation at Davos is a rare occurrence. A standing ovation for a speech implicitly rebuking the President of the United States is practically unheard of. World leaders were privately sharing transcripts. The message resonated because it articulated what every ally of the United States was privately fearing. If America can do this to Canada, its closest, most loyal, most integrated ally, it can do it to anyone. Canada is no longer playing the historical role of the polite neighbor, quietly managing an unruly giant. Ottawa has emerged as the intellectual architect of a new coalition. From Canberra to Tokyo to Berlin, foreign ministries are studying Canada's blueprint. They are watching how Ottawa uses legal frameworks, international arbitration, and rapid market diversification to neutralize American aggression. By attempting to isolate and humiliate Canada, the United States has inadvertently elevated Canada to the vanguard of the free world. Ottawa is leading by example, proving that middle powers do not have to choose between subservience and ruin. And while speeches in Davos and historical rhetoric in Quebec set the tone, true geopolitical power relies on the hard reality of strategic infrastructure and resources, the ultimate leverage. The Washington administration's aggressive posture was based on an illusion of absolute supremacy. But when the rhetoric meets the hard reality of strategic infrastructure and resources, the limits of American power are starkly revealed. Consider the ultimate case study of logic versus bluster, the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This massive infrastructure project connecting Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario, is a vital artery for North American commerce. It was fully funded by Canada at a cost of over $4 billion, yet, in a fit of pique, the U.S. president took to social media, falsely claiming the bridge was built without American content and threatened to block its opening, demanding ownership. It was an extortion attempt played out in public. A lesser government might have panicked. The Canadian response, however, was a masterclass in neutralizing political theater with incontrovertible facts. Ottawa did not shout. Ottawa simply produced the receipts. They calmly pointed out to the global press and to American domestic stakeholders that the bridge was built using massive amounts of American steel. They pointed out that it employed thousands of American union workers. They gently reminded the White House that the fast-tracking of the bridge's permits had actually been approved during the president's own first term. By applying a steady stream of cold, indisputable contractual facts, Canada exposed the American threat as hollow and legally unenforceable. The bluster evaporated upon contact with reality. As Carney noted, the situation was handled by being calm, measured, factual, not rattled, not intimidated, just steady. It was the adult in the room gently disarming a tantrum. But the Gordie Howe Bridge is merely a surface-level example of Canada's true leverage. Beneath the surface lies the unspoken reality that terrifies the Pentagon and American industrial planners, the arsenal of critical minerals and energy, The United States has grand ambitions for the 21st century. It wishes to decouple its supply chains from China. It wishes to build a massive fleet of next-generation fighter jets, advanced munitions, and electric vehicles. It wishes to lead the green energy transition. Here is the geopolitical reality. The United States cannot achieve a single one of these strategic imperatives without Canada. Canada sits upon one of the world's most vast, secure, and accessible reserves of cobalt, lithium, uranium, nickel, and rare earth elements. These are the building blocks of modern military technology and the future economy. Furthermore, Canada remains the most secure and reliable source of energy, both petroleum and hydroelectric, for the American grid. Washington can levy 35% tariffs on softwood lumber and maple syrup. But it knows, and Ottawa knows, that the United States cannot survive a Canadian embargo on critical strategic resources. Canada has chosen not to weaponize these resources, maintaining its commitment to the rule of law and free trade. But the leverage is there. It is the silent, colossal weight sitting on Canada's side of the scale. Ottawa holds the keys to the resources the U.S. desperately needs for its own national security, and by remaining calm, Canada reminds Washington that true power does not need to shout. What are your thoughts on Canada's resource leverage? Should we be more aggressive in using it, or is this calm, steady restraint the right move for our long-term security? Let me know down below. But there is one final piece to this puzzle that we must address, perhaps the most profound transformation of all, and it didn't happen on the world stage in Davos or in the Oval Office. It happened right here within the borders of Canada itself. For decades, political analysts have pointed to Canada's internal divisions as its greatest vulnerability. We are a massive, sprawling geography, often economically and culturally fragmented. The historic tensions between the energy-rich West, the manufacturing hubs of Ontario, and the fiercely independent culture of Quebec have frequently made national consensus feel like an impossible dream. Washington's aggressive posture was inherently predicated on exploiting these very fractures. The assumption in the Oval Office was that the pain of the 35% tariffs would pit Canadian provinces against each other. They believed that Alberta would demand capitulation to save its oil exports, while Ontario would beg for mercy to save its auto sector, causing the federal government to collapse under the weight of regional infighting. But the exact opposite occurred. The intense heat of American economic hostility did not shatter Canada. It acted as the forge for an unprecedented national unity. Prime Minister Carney achieved what generations of politicians have struggled to do. He aligned the provincial premiers into a single, impenetrable phalanx. When Washington threatened the Gordie Howe Bridge, it wasn't just the federal government pushing back. It was the Premier of Ontario standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister. When tariffs threatened the resource sector, the Western premiers didn't fracture the coalition. They fully supported the pivot toward Indo-Pacific markets. The external threat of the U.S. administration effectively neutralized Canada's internal political squabbles. Think about what this means for the Canadian national psyche, particularly for those of you who have watched this bilateral relationship evolve over the last 50 years. For the generation that grew up under the looming, inescapable shadow of the American economic colossus, the default posture has too often been one of polite accommodation. The global cultural stereotype was the endlessly apologetic, deferential Canadian, always careful not to upset the giant next door. That era is decisively over. What we are witnessing today is the forging of a quietly formidable national character. It is a psychological emancipation. This is no longer just about trade balances, tariff percentages, or supply chains. It is about national dignity. It is about proving on the global stage that a modern democracy does not need to be loud, chaotic, or reactionary to project strength. It proves that intellect, preparation, and an unshakable adherence to the rule of law are far more potent weapons than early morning social media tirades. Canada has demonstrated that you can look the most aggressive administration in modern American history directly in the eye, refuse to blink, and actually walk away stronger. Have you felt this renewed sense of national pride and unity in your own community? Share your experiences in the comments, because this internal shift might be the most important part of this entire story. So, where does this leave us as we look toward the horizon and face the new North American reality? In July 2026, the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is scheduled for a mandatory review. When this trade crisis began, the architects of the tariffs in Washington assumed that Canada would arrive at those negotiations in 2026 battered, bruised, and desperate to sign whatever terms the Americans dictated. They could not have been more wrong. Because of the strategic brilliance of the past year, Canada will approach the USMCA review not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign powerhouse. Canada will enter the room with a diversified global economy that no longer relies exclusively on the American consumer. It will enter the room backed by a united domestic front and a coalition of middle powers who view Ottawa as their geopolitical vanguard. It will enter the room holding the strategic minerals the American military-industrial complex desperately requires. The story of the 35% tariff ultimatum is not a story of American strength. It is a story of a colossal strategic failure. It is a testament to the enduring truth that loud, aggressive, emotion-driven tactics will ultimately shatter when they strike the bedrock of quiet competence, economic agility, and an unwavering, uncompromising commitment to national sovereignty. Canada was tested. The sovereignty of the nation was challenged in a way it has not been since the War of 1812, and Canada proved that the era of American economic dictation is permanently over. It has been replaced by a mature, self-reliant, and fiercely independent Canadian global strategy. The United States demanded submission, but instead, they woke a sleeping giant. Now, it's your turn. Are you confident in Canada's position heading into the 2026 USMCA review? Leave your predictions in the comments below. If you found this analysis insightful, please hit the like button, share this video with your fellow Canadians who need to hear the real story, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue this vital conversation. Thank you for watching.